Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite ways to catch them, and that's sight fishing for cruising fish. Not bedding fish, but fish that are cruising up and down the bank or are out on shallow flats. It's a great way to catch some really big fish, but it's also one of the most frustrating ways to fish because a lot of times you see way more fish than you can get to bite. But I've got for you a bunch of ways to trigger those fish into biting. I want to give you my best baits, but I also want to give you some good tips and tricks that are going to allow you to get those fish to bite the baits that you're presenting them. Because a lot of times people just get frustrated because they think the fish aren't biting the baits that they're throwing at them. The reality is those fish are well aware of that angler, and you've taken them out of potentially an aggressive mode and turned them into much more of a protective mode where they're not going to bite your bait at that point. So I've got for you three really good tips along with the baits that I like to use in that situation. Before I get into that, though, I do want to remind you guys that I've got a members only page. And if that's something that interests you, some additional monthly videos from me, a monthly live stream, direct contact access to me, please check out my members only tab. You can do that by going to the homepage on my YouTube homepage and clicking the join button. All the information you need is there. Also, if you're looking for some help on your local lakes, check out the lake breakdowns that I've done with fishthemoment.com. We give 40 waypoints based on the specific season to help you break down those lakes. So that's a really good thing to do too if you're struggling on a few lakes, or maybe you're going to a new lake for the first time and want a little bit of help. And a lot of these lakes that I've marked up have good shallow flats, which are some of my favorite things to do. Whether you're fishing largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass, most aggressive fish at some point will get up and roam shallow flats. And generally speaking, when they're up roaming those shallow flats or those shallow shorelines, they're in an aggressive feeding manner. So it's important to recognize that a lot of times those fish are shallow to eat. But having said that, we find that a lot of times we can't get those fish to eat our baits. But I think that's more has to do with the fact that the fish know we are there versus us throwing the wrong bait. So a couple of things that you can do to really help you target these fish and be have a much better percentage of getting them to bite has to do with several things. The first is simply when you see a fish, they've probably already seen you. So the most important thing you can do is drop a waypoint or mark that specific area where you saw them and keep going. Don't just sit there and really work that fish and chase them down the bank. The best thing you can do is mark it, keep going, mark another couple fish, keep going, mark another couple fish, and then come right back to the first one that you saw and blind fish it from a much longer distance. Make long casts. Don't get right up where you saw that fish. Don't necessarily get up there and start looking for that fish. Fish the area where you saw that fish cruising. And more times than not, those fish kind of have a home zone, meaning they're roaming a certain stretch of bank or a certain area of the flat, and they're generally going to be there when you come back. Now, you may not always get them to bite again, but you have a much better chance at getting them to bite when you come back and make long casts at them. So that's the first thing. The second thing has to do with sun positioning. I always want to try to keep the sun in my face. And the reason for that is if the fish is coming down the bank and they're looking at something, I want that sun to be between us. Meaning, if the fish is looking back and looking at the sun, there's a greater chance that they're not going to be able to see me as much as if they're looking at me or away from the sun. That's something that I think is important. Now, you can't always dictate how that's going to be because the fish is coming down the bank from one direction or the other, but you can choose banks where you work into or away from the sun. So it's something to keep in mind. That's a really uh, small thing to do, but it makes a very big impact on your success. So that's another thing for you. You also want to keep in mind that anytime you're fishing for these cruising fish, that a lot of times they've got very specific isolated targets, right? So whether it's a dock or a laydown tree or a log, but they've kind of got those home ranges like I was saying before. And if you recognize that there's something coming up in front of you that's a prime target, you want to make casts at those to generally give those fish a better opportunity at getting your bait without knowing that you're there. If you can hit that target from a long distance away, you really increase your odds at catching these roaming fish. So that's another thing. When it comes to baits, I have two primary types of baits that I like to use. The first is going to be your ultra finesse, really slow moving baits, the kind that you just throw up in front of the fish and really try to just soak your bait, because it is important to lead the fish. If you see the fish cruising down the bank, don't make a cast on its head. Don't make a cast a foot in front of it. Make a long cast way in front of it where you lead the fish almost to the point where they don't even know your bait is there. If they swim up to your bait without knowing it's there, you have a much better chance of getting them to bite. If you lead that fish by 5 feet, you're gonna probably spook that fish versus getting them interested in coming to eat it. So you're much better off making a long cast in front of the fish when you lead them. So that's another important tip. So when it comes to the bait choices, when I'm making a long leading cast, I want a finesse approach or I want a topwater approach. The finesse approach is very much for the obvious reasons. You're trying to put a good finesse presentation, something that's not going to spook the fish, something that the fish can swim up to, and you don't really have to move it. So if we're talking about finesse presentations, a weightless wacky rig, this is a Maxcent General, one of my favorites for a wacky rig. This is one of the best baits for cruising fish. It's not the only one that I throw. Another one would be a really light Ned rig. This is a TRD, a finesse TRD from Z-Man, and I'll pair it up with like a Fusion 19 half head, a 1/16 ounce, so a very, very light one. So it does fall very slowly, makes a small splash on entrance. And when it falls to the bottom, I'll let it sit there until the fish gets up to it, and that's when I might start moving it. So a light jig head will sit more on top of any sort of bottom filament or muck that might be on the bottom, and therefore I can fish it clean. If I go with a 1/4 ounce head, it really might bury down into some weeds or some bottom gunk that's on the bottom, and it can really mess up that cast. But when I throw a little Ned rig, I'm using a very light head, a 16th ounce, a 20th ounce, something along those lines where it's very, very lightly weighted. Another one, you guys know how much I love the Core Tackle Hover Rig. I'll match it up with a little Live Tricks like this, a Bass Tricks Live Tricks. And this is just a great natural presentation where you throw it way up in front of the fish. You let it very slowly fall down. This is the 3/64 ounce size. You let it fall down. I'll let it sit on the bottom. When the fish gets close to it, if they're not making a direct move to eat it or move towards it, I'll give it a quick little pop, a little wrist snap, and that bait will make a quick motion that'll dart around, and that can do something to trigger that fish's reactionary bite on it. And you can get bites on the hover rig better than a lot of other presentations. The second type of category of baits that I'm going to go after are topwaters. And the reason for topwaters is it gives the fish uh, a hard chance to really figure out what it is. They see something on the surface, but they can't really determine what it is. A lot of times when there is something on the surface, that's something that could be struggling and therefore becomes a forage for the bass. So it's an easy meal. The other key with a topwater is when you make those long leading casts, you can let your bait sit there on the surface without moving it. You don't have to worry about it getting caught in the bottom, any sort of grass, any sort of stuff, that could potentially throw your bait off, like you could have happen if you have a bait that sinks down to the bottom. The other thing is a lot of times those fish that are cruising the bank are looking for that easy meal. They're looking for bluegill. They're looking for minnows. They're looking for bait fish that are in shallow water and potentially are injured. And that's where topwater comes in. The one thing I really want to point out with my topwaters, though, is I like to throw very small topwaters when I'm fishing for cruising fish. One of my favorites is this little Don Ivino Splash It. It's a small popper. This thing is really good at just throwing out there. You let it sit, you let the ripples disappear. Again, if the fish is coming towards it, don't move your bait at all. A lot of times they know it's there, they're going after it, they're going to check it out. If they're not making a direct movement at it, then that's when I'll start working the top water to try to get their attention, try to bring them over to eat it. But a small popper, in my opinion, is much better than something that throws off a bunch of commotion. And that little Don Ivino splash it is a killer when it comes to triggering those cruising fish. Another one that I really like, this is a small Megabass Dog X. These little guys are great little walking baits. So I like a small finesse walking bait, something that doesn't throw a ton of water, something that you can walk basically in place. So I can twitch this and it just stays almost in the same position. But again, because these fish are usually up in shallow water, it's generally going to be clear water if I'm actually looking for the fish. From that standpoint, they get a really good look at the bait. So a small walking bait like this little Dog X is something that can generate a lot more strikes than a bigger three hooked spook or something along those lines, because that's a much more intimidating bait. And a lot of times it's a small finessey topwater that will really generate that reaction out of those fish to come eat it. So don't think just because you're seeing fish and not getting them to bite that they're not catchable. You just got to make sure you position correctly, you mark where they're at, and you're throwing the right baits. I'll put links to all these baits in the video description. So if you want to check them out at Tackle Warehouse, you can do that. And guys, this is the time of year. Get out on some of those shallow flats, start using your eyes, find these fish and catch them. They're some of the biggest fish in the lake. It's one of the best ways to fish, and it's not a whole lot more rewarding than like actually stalking the fish. It's a fun way to fish. So hopefully guys, you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new tip video coming out tomorrow.